Welcome, Indie Reads Aloud listeners. We are back again today with another fun episode of the program. Today, I have a new to me author. Martin Shoemaker is here today, and he is a science fiction author, which is really exciting because we don't get many sci-fi authors on the program. Martin, welcome. I'm so glad you're here today.
Thank you for having me. I am really excited for this.
Thank you. I'm excited to have you. I love meeting new authors and I love hearing new stories, as I have said more times than I can count in the last 3 years on this program. I am a recovering 6-year-old and I just love it when people read out loud to me. I'm that little kid who's sitting in the front row at the library. So I'm really excited to hear your story. And this is how, like many of our listeners, this is how I get my TBR list written is who do I need to add to my list next? And I do that by listening to folks like you read. So I'm really glad you're here today.
Thank you.
So tell me just a quick bit about your background, Martin. I know that you're a gaming programmer and you're also an author. What other notable things have you done in your career leading up to being a full-time author?
Mostly a programmer. I've been a developer since like 1980, 81. So I spent a lot of time in the programming, but writing was always a passion that I just kept waiting to get around to. And it took me till I was 47 to do it, but I got to it finally.
That's absolutely fantastic. What led you? Is it your programming background or something else that led you to write science fiction?
I cannot remember anything else ever really catching my attention. I grew up in the era of the Apollo program and Star Trek.
Ah,
When you have those in your head when you're 4 years old, you're kind of warped, so to
yeah,
speak.
sure. Yeah, when we're going to the moon and Gene Roddenberry is taking us to adventures far, far away, it's easy to get locked into that. Absolutely. What have you found as a? I know we talked in the green room a little bit about persistence and always keeping at it, sending out manuscripts for contests or for submission for publication, aside from that persistence factor that we all seem to battle. What do you find the most challenging part about being a novelist?
Uh, the time it takes to get things done if you're not going indie, and if you are going indie, it's a time investment that through practice over the past decade, I am a fast writer, and then I have the slow process of turning that writing into something readers can read.
Okay. I can definitely feel for that. I've been working on my current novel for 2 years now. And I wrote it in the first 9 months. And since then, I've been going through the editorial process because I'm fastidious and I like it to be perfect. So that making it a book part is a challenge sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely understand that. Um, what's the most, in your opinion, the most creative character you've ever brought to life on the page?
That I think has to be the android that eventually came to be named Carrie from my story Today I Am Paul, and then my novel Today I Am Carrie, because the android has, through its programming, strong ability to understand your emotional state and even to try to pretend to be you, which means I'm trying to write a character who has no emotions of its own and then can be inside of your head and understanding what you're going through. And
That
so it
sounds
becomes
like a really
neutral
remarkable,
observer.
yeah, that sounds like a really remarkable characteristic to try to put on the page. I can see
Mm-hmm.
how that would be fun though as well.
Yep.
To jump
Yep.
into the emotional shoes of the character you're mimicking, that might be kind of a fun writing exercise.
It becomes hard to judge people's foibles if you're trying to be inside of their head.
True.
And
Yeah,
so fears about aging, fears about sick relatives and everything, which can often make us act in ways that are irrational and upset the people around us. The android can't get upset because it's understanding your fear.
I like that. I'll have to read that. That sounds very intriguing. All right, the book you're going to share with us today is Ulla, Martian Song Book 1. Is this going to be a trilogy or a much larger series of work?
It is still up in the air. I have a second book idea in mind, and I don't like it. And then I have a third book idea in mind that I do like. I have seen the potential for 9 books,
Wow.
but I
Okay.
think the second book really has to nail it. And that's why I'm torn between the two. I mean, I don't say I dislike the first one, but the second one, but the second one is all set up for the third one.
Got it.
And
Yeah,
I feel like, can I just
sometimes
jump
that
ahead?
bridge novel is a challenge to write.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, so give me just in a couple of sentences the synopsis of this book.
H.G. Wells got everything wrong. The
Okay.
War of the Worlds that he wrote about was not what actually happened. And I can look at his text and I can show you the things he got wrong, such as they launched 10 Martian capsules and 7 of them landed in London. This isn't a war of worlds, it's a war of neighborhoods.
Okay. All right.
And I started having read his book for like the 5th time. I said, if this is wrong, what else did he get wrong? And I started looking for things that made sense from his protagonist's point of view, but might be different from another point of view.
And especially so many years in the future, right? As we look at it from our perspective in today's timeline, you might find many things that are inaccurate.
Yeah. And so I am continuing his story with the 8th and 9th capsule landing in West Michigan, because he just put it in London because that was his neighborhood. He wanted to blow up
Right.
his neighborhood.
Sure, I get it.
I'm going to use mine.
Okay, works for me. I'm looking forward to hearing you read a little bit from this. When you are ready, sir, please take the microphone and read aloud.
And my text here. Eugene Hardy nudged back the brim of his black felt bowler, exposing a bit more of his brown, balding scalp than suited his vanity. But he lifted his head anyway, face straight ahead. If the conductor was going to ignore Eugene, the man would have to do it to his face. Eugene did glance down from time to time, though. He'd grown up on farms and he knew he had to be careful around horses. As he strode across the red bricks of Front Street, toward the waiting train, he carefully stepped around the stinking pool of piss. His shoes might be old, but he kept them clean and polished. Mother wouldn't have it any other way. On the far side of the bricks, the conductor stood in the entryway to the lead passenger car, right behind the small intercity engine. An older man, face almost as gray as the tufts of hair sticking out from his navy blue cap, he managed to look right past Eugene as if no one were there. He just stood in the doorway, arms crossed in his navy jacket, leaning against the frame. When an old couple came up to the door, he in patched up farm overalls, she in a simple flowered dress, both wearing straw hats against the August sun, the conductor stepped aside to let the couple through. A white couple, of course. But then the man stepped back into the entry and positioned himself on the first step. Again, he looked past Eugene. Without saying a word, he said, "Colors go to the rear car." Eugene sighed and he turned north toward the rear. There was a second passenger car immediately north, but Eugene could feel the conductor's eyes boring into the back of his neck. He continued to the battered third car right in front of 2 cargo cars. Eugene climbed the steps, noting as he went to the cracked panes of the windows. The glass was whole in the lead 2 cars, of course. He sighed again. Despite the car being empty, he went all the way to the back, near the porter stand. Maybe the porter, a Negro like himself, would be more welcoming. Eugene bit his lip, holding back the words that tore his insides out. This would never happen back in Gaines. People knew him there. Some alive still remembered voting for father for supervisor 30 years ago. Even across the township line over in Ross Station, folks knew his family there. Some were even church members. Dewey Braun, the station agent, was always happy to see Eugene and never blinked at seating him in the front car, which was seldom more than half full of passengers up from Kalamazoo. Eugene suspected that Dewey even enjoyed scandalizing the small-minded folks of Grand Rapids when a colored man stepped off the lead car. It was Dewey's way of saying that his ancestors had fought for freedom, and that meant something in Ross Station. Eugene tried to get comfortable on the hard wooden seat and to forget that the seats in the front car were padded and covered with leather. He watched the front of the car, waiting for the conductor to come back and take his ticket. He was still waiting when the steam whistle split the air and the car made its first rocking lurch forward. The porter leaned forward. Eugene looked up into a face darker than his. "He won't come back here, sir," the man said. "I'll take your ticket." Eugene reached inside his suit coat and into the pocket of his vest, and he pulled out the ticket and handed it to the porter. "Thank you." He noticed a folded copy of the Herald sticking out from the man's own jacket. "By any chance, are you done with that?" The porter looked down. "It's yesterday's edition, sir." Eugene smiled up. "It's still new to me." The men shared a grin, and the porter handed over the paper. Eugene set down his carpetbag and he unfolded the paper. It was good to have something to pass the time on the way home. Eugene took off his bowler and set it on the seat beside him on top of the bag. Then he unfolded the Herald and had the cream-colored paper out in front of him, shaking it to straighten the page. He stared at the top. August 8, 1907. Then he looked to the left column where the stories began, and he started scanning downward. The Herald usually started with the wire services, leading with news from around the world. Only in the second page or even the third would you find state news, with local news after that. That suited Eugene just fine, since local news often depressed him, while world news let him imagine a different life in a different place. And today, of course, world news dominated, as it had dominated many conversations he'd heard during this trip into town. The Herald opened today with a simple headline: "King George promises swift reprisal for atrocity." What followed was long on opinion and bluster, masquerading as fact, all built around a core truth. The British still didn't know who was responsible for the horrific attacks on London, but all eyes were turned to Kaiser Wilhelm and his German Empire. King George himself was non-committal, and his speech was about the effort of electing a new parliament and tracking down the few survivors who still held office. But the UPI found analysts who explained why only the German Empire had motivation and forces to carry out such an attack, and how England might exact retribution once their government was secure. The British Navy had been untouched in the assault, so the attack hadn't come from the sea. "They couldn't very well have flown in," one colonel was quoted as saying, "and the Navy would have detected movement of machines of war such as these. Mark my words, they shall find local anarchists behind these attacks." But when pressed for specifics about how such anarchists could have put together such a formidable army of war machines, the colonel refused to comment. The story continued in that vein throughout the entire left column of the page, and most of the second column as well. But near the bottom of the second column was a related story. "Prime Minister repudiates journalist." Beneath were just a few short paragraphs. Acting Prime Minister Mayweather issued a statement that His Majesty's government would not be investigating the claims of Mr. Wells of the Evening News that the invasion of London was accomplished by creatures from Mars. The minister said, "This so-called journalist, Mr. Wells, has admitted that he spent a week out of the last month in an asylum in a state of mental collapse brought on by the attacks. I think that is all we need to know about any so-called men from Mars. And we have informed his employer that we shall be granting no interviews to Mr. Wells nor to any of his colleagues who persist in wasting our time at a point where our grand nation needs to rebuild. We shall not spend time on such foolishness." This service attempted to reach Mr. Wells for comment, but his employer said that the man no longer works for the Evening News. They had no forwarding address for him. Eugene had heard the gossip, of course. This Wells had written lurid accounts of the supposed invasion of London by creatures from the Red Planet. The stories had proven popular with the lay audience, but more sophisticated readers scoffed at them. The accounts had appeared as field reports, some by Mr. Wells and some by his unnamed brother, telling of fantastic creatures with fantastic machines laying waste to villages in and around the British capital. But then they had stopped right after a story of refugees fleeing from London and Martian weapons burning British warships. Eugene had found the reports more appropriate for the back pages, where fiction and children's stories were serialized, not something that belonged on the world news page. Shortly after, the wire service had issued an apology that their realistic fiction had been too persuasive and it had promised a correction. And now, of course, the British government had put a stop to the irresponsible abuse of the British people in their time of suffering. In the next column was a story of Kaiser Wilhelm's denial that Germany had anything to do with the situation in England, along with his suggestion that perhaps the British should look to consequences from their own adventures in South Africa and elsewhere. Boer sympathizers, he suggested, perhaps aided by the Afrikaners themselves. He even offered aid convoys to his cousin George, but the tone of the article made clear that the journalist didn't believe a word from the Kaiser's mouth. He found one unnamed source to suggest that any German aid convoy might well be a Trojan horse. What followed were stories from France and Russia explaining that their government stood strong with their British friends and would look ill upon any who took advantage of England during their efforts to rebuild. That surprised Eugene. Both France and Russia had recently had battles of words with the Germans, and analysts expected that Germany might escalate. Many had urged that the late King Edward join in a tripartite pact with France and Russia to contain German aggression. That in itself had surprised Eugene, since some of the same analysts had trumpeted Germany's support for the Boers during England's wars barely half a decade ago. Sometimes he suspected that their preferred side was whichever side would sell the most papers and conflict drew readers. The rest of the world pages took more of a society angle. Eugene skimmed over those. What did he care for the opinions of the elite in other countries where he would never travel? He turned instead to the state news. But Britain dominated much of that news as well. Stories of industrial efforts aimed at markets that might earlier have been served by London. Stories of how the British Navy's preoccupation might impact domestic shipping. Multiple stories of relief efforts as local farmers and churches put together food packages. He got his one smile of the day when he saw that Brother Kellogg and Company were gathering truckloads of cornflakes for shipment overseas. Trust Brother Kellogg to find opportunity in a crisis. Eugene read slowly. The uneven sway of the car made it difficult to track the words. So he's still only on the first page of the state news when the porter said, "Ross Station coming up, sir." Eugene started carefully folding up the paper and then he handed it back toward the porter, but the man shook his head. "I'm done with it, sir. You can keep it." "Thank you, brother." Eugene used the folded paper to fan himself. Despite the broken windows, the breeze had done little to cool off the car. He looked up as the train slowed through the familiar hills of Byron Township and headed toward Ross Station. He could feel the stress leaching out through his breath. Home. Then he noticed something unusual up ahead. There was another train on the siding at the station. It was big, with cars painted in reds and golds and greens and blues, with banners and mirrors. He narrowed his eyes, wishing he hadn't broken his spectacles, as he tried to make out the banner on the caboose closest to them. As he drew closer, he read, "Ward Family Amusements, the Midwest's greatest show." A circus. Eugene's heart raced a bit. Father and mother would never have approved, but Eugene had always been curious about circuses since he was a kid. Once in Decatur, Illinois, one had come to town while he had been teaching there, but funds had been too tight and he had passed on the opportunity. But now, as his own train started to slow, it drew closer to the circus train, and he saw posters pasted to the walls of each car. But his spirits dropped when he read the posters. World's Fattest Man, the Ape Boy, the Two-Headed Girl. This wasn't a circus. A circus was jugglers and elephants and aerialists. This was a freak show where you paid to stare at people. Eugene hated to be stared at, and he didn't see as it was right to stare at other people either, for things they could no more control than he could control the color of his skin. If that was all this circus was, he wouldn't worry about scraping up the cost of a ticket. But still he watched the posters, hoping for a picture of a lion or a clown or a trapeze act. Something worth the price of admission in his eyes. At last, when his train came to rest, Eugene looked out at the strange, garish poster directly across from him there. A big blue banner depicted a tower with a large clock face topped by a tall spire. Above the tower rose a grayish-green monstrosity, big eyes and a bloodied beak with octopus tentacles sprouting from its head. Over the top of the creature, in lurid orange letters, were the words, The Monster from Mars. I think I read just like a little bit faster than I did on my rehearsal for this. We're at 12 and a half minutes, so that's pretty good. And that's the hook I wanted to end on.
Perfect. I love it when a plan comes together. I think this is a really interesting story. I think it's going to be a fun read for everyone. Tell me, what was the most fun for you in creating this book?
Well, first, for your readers who've never heard the term before, I'm a pantser, meaning I don't really plan the story. I find the story as I'm writing it.
Yep.
But I did need to do research because I wasn't born in 1907. I wasn't around. My dad wasn't around.
Right, exactly. Yeah, my grandfather was 7 years old.
Yep. So I had to do some research. I did some research, first of all, on Wells's story and found this interesting little paper. You may be familiar with the Baker Street Irregulars of Sherlock Holmes Society of people who do
Absolutely.
academic research on Holmes stories.
Sure.
There's also a Wells Society, and they have all these academic debates and papers and so on Wells's stories. And I found one that made the argument that, unlike what most people said, most people think that the Wells story happens in like 1890 or 1895 or 1899. They found textual evidence that the actual invasion was 1907 by looking at star charts and astronomical evidence and stuff. They came up with 1907, so that gave me a time frame. And then I started searching and researching the West Michigan area of 1907, and I discovered the Hardy family. The character in my story is a real character. Obviously, none of the Martians are real, but
right.
Hardy was a real character who grew up across the street from where I grew up. Up the hill from me, but across the street, essentially. He was the first Black high school student to graduate in the state of Michigan.
Wow. Okay.
His father was the first Black elected official in the state of Michigan. I can take you to the township that I've mentioned in here. I can take you to their township headquarters and show you a plaque dedicated to his father.
So when it's got to be really exciting to find characters like that that you can then intertwine into your fiction. That is kind of a cool thing.
Especially these, because I don't want to say disparaging things about my townships where I grew up, but I wouldn't have expected them on the forefront of service of civil rights back in 1870.
But that's a very cool thing to discover about your home state.
Exactly. And then so I'm doing all this sorts of research of the area, places I grew up, and learning about them. Learning about the fact that the state of Michigan used to have, they called them plank roads. This was before we had.
Yep, I remember. Yeah.
We had the plank roads, which were literally planks of wood set down so that you didn't have the road dissolve into mud.
That's right. Yeah, there's a town over on this side of the state, the eastern side of the state. It's a reenactment town where they have those plank roads. It's very cool to walk on them.
And the street I grew up on was the plank road between Grand Rapids and Kalamazoo, and I never knew that.
Those are fun connections to make. I can see where the research for this book, even though it is a science fiction book, research into real life, I can see how that would be really enticing about writing a story like this and continuing so as you continue to write the series moving forward.
Exactly. There are things that I have for future series that are parts of the community history that I just never knew. Just the smallest thing. And you're from that side of the state, you're in West Michigan area, so you didn't know local town streets. Like I grew up a mile or so from a street called Clyde Park.
Okay.
Well, as I do the research on this, I'm finding that the street called Clyde Park is named that because it went downtown to a particular farm where a particular farmer gentleman was very proud of his Clydesdale collection.
Perfect.
And that was a collection in the time frame that I'm at. It's like, I need Clydesdales in this story.
Yeah. I'm so glad to hear you talk about this because so many authors are overwhelmed with the task of, especially in historical fiction, the task of doing research. And it's nice to hear a writer talk about the excitement behind the research. So I'm really glad that you've been on the program today to share that with any writers coming up in the field, that truly research can be a lot of fun.
Even a small thing, it was in there in the text. I doubt anybody's going to pick it up, but it was very clearly in there. If you read my description of the newspaper, I went back to 1907 editions, issues of the Grand Rapids Herald, which is long defunct, but back then it was the premier paper.
Mhm.
And newspapers were laid out different. For
Yes.
young listeners, the newspapers, when they used to bring the internet to your house every day on pieces of
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. You'd have to be very young to not know the difference, but yeah.
but the layout of these things was,
Yeah.
you would start the first story in the upper left column,
Yeah.
and it would run all the way down the column
Right. Yep.
and up to the next column, and then in the
I
middle of the column you'd start another story.
I started my career in journalism. I know how that works. Yeah.
Yeah.
Super fun. I am so glad that you were on the program today. Thank you for sharing your story. And I hope that you'll come back and read from the next book in the series when you have it out.
It's in progress once I decide which book is the next one.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time today, Martin.
Thank you.